Hey everybody, this is Perch. And one of the weirder things about 2022 in comics is that at times I find myself nostalgic for 90s comics. And why I find that weird is that the 90s era of comics was not great. I know, for several of you it was the best time and that was the best comics out there, but if you were running a shop or if you could actually transport yourself to the 90s and actually consume, the comics that were being offered back then, one thing that was pretty true is that a lot of them were not great. There was a lot of very forgettable comics in the 90s. And so to be nostalgic for the 90s, a time that also resulted in, near bankruptcy for Marvel, among many other things, it's odd. It's odd that we sit in a world where, we miss that era. One of the things about the 90s that was frustrating when you were in the 90s is that a lot of comic books felt exactly the same. And this is what largely killed Image, by the way. Again, a lot of people have nostalgic feelings about what Image did, but they're forgetting about like the mini clones of the Extreme books. Or the fact that Wildstorm would have things pop up that were or comics would start and never finish. You wait like 2 years to get the next issue of something. And really, in many ways, the 90s were the predecessor to crowdfunding. But it's some of those books were good, but there were long gaps, long waits, and a lot of cloned material. Every comic, or it felt like nearly every comic, had to do something extreme. The characters had to have leather jackets with spikes on them. They needed to have a character on the team that was blood something, or it's just it was. Look at some of these things. Adam X was kind of quintessential 90s. And a lot of that stuff was very tiresome. They weren't great reads in the comics. I know, I've said this before, and people are like, oh, speak for yourself. No, I mean, chances are you do feel the same. You're just kind of feeling like I do now in this weird place in 2022 where you would like just some lighthearted superhero action kind of comics, things that are, not necessarily, not at all deconstruction of the hero, not kind of in-depth analysis, not downtime, but just heroes showing up, fighting somebody, flashy costumes, all the rest. That's what you crave, and the reason why you crave is because very, very few comics are offering that, close to none. In many ways, I've done this video before talking about how there are editors, people at Marvel, like Walt Simonson could never sell because his style is old, it's dated. A lot of those classic comic pencilers, comic artists, are considered just they wouldn't sell today. Now, of course, they would sell today just fine. Certainly, you need to market it. You can't just quietly put it out there. But you take a guy like Brett Booth, who does comment on the channel every now and then. Hey, Brett. And Brett has a style that is, I would say, modern, looks perfectly fine today. But of course, yes, he did do comics during the 90s, and he draws very good kind of classic superhero action. And I've never heard this about Brett directly. I've seen other people claim this, but I've never heard anybody say that Brett Booth was, he's kind of like his art style is dated. Nobody in their right mind would say that, and his books sell. But that mentality of, hey, this artist who was popular like 20, 30 years ago, no way that artist could sell today. That style is dated. It's the same logic gets applied to why you can't have, classic superhero books that look, feel, and behave like they did in the 90s. What's kind of galling about this, and why I keep bringing up this point, and I don't see a lot of people hook on to it, but with Marvel and DC publishing over 150 comics combined a month, and Image usually bringing in at least 50, you're talking about 200 books before you even get to the indies beyond the big three. You're telling me out of 200 books, you can't have one title that is written, drawn, and feels like that era? Not one? I mean, it's silly to say to do one, but keep in mind, 200 books, 1%. 1% would be 2 comics a month. 1%. 10%, 20. I mean, don't you find it strange that, they can't even put out a couple books? Nostalgia is a big deal in cinema, in books, and TV shows. I mean, Stranger Things is a mega popular show on Netflix. New season dropped, people are all over it, trending, it's huge. What's one of the biggest core components of Stranger Things? Well, it's nostalgia. Nostalgia for the 80s. That's why they do the music they do. That's the theme and the setting. And so a lot, it's very 80s by design. When they talk about doing 80s things, let's go to the mall. Look, let's hang out in B. Dalton. Hey, who wants to get a big gulp? I mean, just the various things that are very attached to the 90s come out in that show. Sorry, not the 90s, the 80s. The 80s, sorry. I'm mixing up comments. The 80s. It is a show about nostalgia for the 80s, and it's usually popular. Nostalgia sells. So when you look at comic books, they can't even, like the X-Men Legends book, even that, using classic creators, they're still trying to kind of write them in current style, but with, creators from the past. It's still not, just kind of good, simple action. I've done these comic comparison videos, and I'll do some more. But if you look at Spider-Man, if you look at Man of Steel, if you look at X-Men, I mean, X-Men's perhaps the biggest example of that. There's a style of storytelling where you have multiple action sequences inside of one comic. And, the thought, it wasn't the most cerebral comic, not by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm talking as somebody who likes Grant Morrison, likes what happened with Vertigo. I have no issues with Neil Gaiman. I thought Neil Gaiman did a perfectly fine Sandman series. I like the Thinking Man's comic for sure. But we live in a time period where I find myself nostalgic for not all the comics being like they were in the 90s. I don't want them all. I don't even want the majority. I would just like a couple. And it seems particularly baffling when you have things like the Avengers and the Justice League and comics that are struggling to kind of find their way. Even the X-Men. So what's weird is it feels like the publishers kind of vaguely understand this is a problem, but they don't understand how to deal with it, or they don't want to deal with it. So, like, you get Hickman's X-Men, which is a very big departure, definitely different from the X-Men of the 80s and the 90s, very different style. And, it's selling some books, it's doing okay, and then the sales start to kind of drop a little bit, and there's some issues, and people are like, I kind of miss that old thing. So, like, okay, we'll create X-Men Legends, and we'll put it out there, but, we're still going to kind of keep it more modern. And then it's like, hey, Hickman's leaving, and we have all this stuff going on in Krakoa. We're going to make X-Men. We're actually going to make an X-Men title again, and that will kind of, scratch the itch of people who like X-Men fans. Are not going to be based on Krakoa. Instead, they're going to be based in New York, so it's going to feel a little bit more like and they're going to have classic superhero adventures, classic X-Men adventures, much, much different. Hey, there goes a ambulance of some kind. Cool. We're going to do that. Maybe that ambulance is headed for, Marvel sales. Yeah, good luck. Get there quick. Anyway, but you pick up the comic, and it doesn't read anything like that time period. So it's like, we're finally going to give you what you want. We're finally going to give you this kind of throwback to this other era. But then, you pick up a book, you read it, it's nothing like that. And I kind of, here's a crazy part. A lot of people dismiss the books in the 80s and certainly the 90s as being simplistic. Anyone could do them. They're so dumb simple. It doesn't take there's been current writers who have made comments about how the 90s had such stupid storytelling. Anybody could do it. If anybody could do it, why isn't anyone doing it now? Because I agree. I think it would be, I don't think it's that hard. I think it's far more hard to crank out a 22-page script about people who are in a relationship, but they're not sure, and then they have lunch, and then there's some kind of problem with their job, and like that stuff is I think harder to write, and certainly harder for the artist to even get up any caring at all to draw it. So why not take the easy route? Not for all the comics, not for 50% of the comics. I mean, hell, right now, I mentioned this, 200 books between Marvel, DC, and Image, at least. Usually it's higher than that. 200 books. Imagine five books out of 200 that kind of had that feeling. Wouldn't that be nice? I think that it would scratch an itch that people really have for that kind of that time period, and still leave, you know, just got tons of books doing this modern stuff. But again, the belief is that that style of storytelling is dated. Nobody would buy it, except when they do facsimile editions, when they do reprints, when they put out some of the old stuff. Everybody goes for it. If nobody would buy it, why is there still such high interest in the back issue market for this era? Why? And don't you think some publisher would go, you know what? We should stop effing around with this and actually put out something that we think, really appeals to that generation, that type of comic reader. Let's put one comic out, see what happens. You would think that would be a good idea. Look at the kind of insane things that Marvel greenlights for a comic. Just the most bizarre pitches that you've ever seen, and yet you don't have one that's like, hey, let's make one comic that captures all those people who liked Wildstorm Extreme, kind of that time period. Let's make 2022's version of Gen 13. Why? It's free money. I hate feeling nostalgic for the 90s, a time period that was really rough from a business perspective. Comic industry, it was brutal. I have a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that I am nostalgic for content during that time period. But I think I speak for a lot of people who would just love to have a couple books that scratch that particular itch. And I hate the very disingenuous way that people are like, oh, you want to turn all the books into dumb 90s storytelling. No, not all, not most, not even more than 5%. I take 5%. 5% of the books published every month tries to capture that storytelling, leaving 95% to do whatever the hell you want. Come take the money. What a weird state this is. Anyway, thanks for listening.